there's water all over the kitchen and hallway flooring.
Can't talk, I'm painting.
And what's all this? Paint? Paint brushes? A stone? How primitive. At least it explains this mess.
Shh! Important stuff is going on here. I need to concentrate.
Concentrate. But really, painting a flower, if that indeed is what it is, onto a rock is hardly all that taxing.
For your information, Chucky Chalk, it's a peace lily. You remember peace? I'm painting it for the Remembrance Day ceremony, putting it on the statue at the Cenotaph downtown.
Really? You're going to put that on the cenotaph?
I am putting all of my thank you thoughts and happy life memories into it so the spirits of the dead soldiers will know what I am thanking them for their sacrifice. Now, if you'll excuse me.
And while I admire your painfully slow dedication, I do wonder why a lily and not a poppy. The poppy is synonymous with war and Remembrance Day, after all.
I know the poppy is synonymous with war, and that, friend, is why I am painting the lily. Synonymous, well, because it represents peace.
It would be much easier if you bought one like I did and simply pin it on, and not fuss with all that mess. And the money goes into the coffers of the Royal Canadian Legions to help veterans. Win-win!
Problem is, I don't want to wear or paint a poppy exactly because they're all about war, and red like blood, and icky like war. And I don't want to paint all of my emotions in red, and war, and sadness, okay? And now I'm all out of whack. I gotta get back to my Zen zone.
My great-grandfather, Tobias Chalk, the 732nd, lived in South Africa and was part of the strategic planning wing for the RAF desert campaigns of 1941 and 42. The staccato of his nose pressed against the slate. Lines, dots, swirls. Lines, dots, swirls. He made a difference and made us proud, by God. Just to have been there, been a part of his all. That's guts. That is glory. And even though he was ground to dust, his was an honorable sacrifice to the greater good.
My great-aunt Belle Cream, even though she was a pacifist.
Now why am I not surprised? All this talk of the peace lily.
I was going to say, until you interrupted me, that though she was a pacifist, she took the slogan, "Food is a weapon, don't waste it," to heart. So, in the name of lending a helping, she shipped out to do her part to help the Brits get fed. And sadly, she was lost in the great meltdown of 41. My grand never got over it. She moved it away to nothing. So you can see why I might be more interested in peace lilies. Thank you very much.
What a lot of sentimental twaddle, Charlie. In war, one expects casualties. As General Patton once said, and I quote, "Battle is the most magnificent competition in which a human being can indulge."
Bullets cannot be recalled. They cannot be uninvented, but they can be taken out of a gun. Martin Amis.
The object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other bastard die for his. Patton!
The world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. Albert Einstein, there never was a good war, nor a bad peace. Benjamin Franklin, Oliver Marcus Molloy. If you like war, be a nationalist. If you like peace, be a citizen of the world.
Onward, Christian soldiers, marching on to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. You onward, Christian soldiers, Christ
painting time? Make some art? I wore my smock. I brought my rock. And what do I come to? World War III. Now someone explain what's going on.
Well, I was just expounding the virtues.
One at a time, please! Charlie, go ahead.
But
Chucky, you'll get your turn. Relax.
I was just sitting here minding my own business in my Zen zone, doing my peace lily on a rock painting, finding just the right tint for the center of the flower. Not too yellow, not too pink, just right.
who cares about the pink and the yellow? We'll be here all day.
Chucky has a point, Charlie. Cut to the chase.
Oh, well, the long and the short of it is, he came in and started getting me riled up with his talk of the glories of war. And I lost the zone. And I lost my temper.
Chucky?
I was just pointing out that war is necessary and an ancient occupation of humankind. Not pleasant, but there you have it. General Patton once said,
Him again.
"Battle brings out all that is best."
Huh.
Well, let's see if I understand both of you a little bit. So, you're both on different sides when it comes to war and how humans settle their differences. Is that about right?
Succinctly and well put as usual, Mr. Moderator.
Well, that about sums it up, yeah.
Well, why is it that after 200,000 years, when we have a conflict, it's quickly put up your dukes? Tonight, for our conversations of Hear and Be Heard, 10 community conversations, we're going to discuss just that. What's up with all the fisticuffs? Our monthly conversations are
Co-hosted by the Red Deer Public Library.
And the Red Deer Puppetry Collective. Yeah!
Hey!
And hosted by Mr. Moderator, Matt Gould.
So listen, if I leave you two, are you going to be okay? Because I got to go get ready for the chat, get dressed, meet the community members we're going to have a conversation with. Are you going to be okay?
Sure we are. Chucky is going to paint himself a bright red poppy on the stone you brought, and I'm going to get back into my Zen zone to finish my peace lily. See you later, Mr. Moderator.
A bientôt, mon ami.
Cheers, you two, and please keep the peace.
War, huh? Yeah. What is it good for?
Absolutely nothing. No war. Huh. Good God, yo. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. War. Who's over there? What a war.
Hi, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the puppet show. And look, I got changed. And now I'm wearing the clothes I should be wearing. So as you know, my name is Matt Gould, and we often start with a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to go ahead and read that right now before we get into our community conversation tonight. The Red Deer Public Library and the Red Deer Puppetry Collective recognizes that the land on which we live and work and play is the meeting place of Treaty 5, Treaty 6, and Treaty 7 regions, representing the Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Kainai, Stoney Nakoda peoples. And this area is also the territory of the Métis, Nehiyawak, and Saulteaux peoples. And we strive in the spirit of the treaties to keep this a place of trust, friendship, and promise. So I'm going to start with a few introductions and sort of help frame this evening's conversation. But once again, welcome to all of you in Zoom land. So this is our second last Hear and Be Heard 10 community conversations. I can't believe it. This is our 9th out of 10, and the next one happens in December. And boy, I was going to say time flies when you're in lockdown, and we're swinging from Zoom live to Zoom pre-recorded to maybe in-persons, maybe back to Zoom. So it's like a really wacky ride, and I'm sad to say that it ain't over by any stretch of the imagination. So when I proposed this theme to the Red Deer Puppetry Collective and Tatiana at Red Deer Public Library by posing the question, why do human beings always seem to jump very quickly to put up your dukes? I was under the assumption that humans were always ready to go to battle, but apparently it would appear that there is some very interesting research about whether or not humans have always been at war with each other. Some are offering real food for thought, but at first we're going to just introduce our two community members who've joined us tonight. We'll ask their first question, and then we'll get into a few ideas around this. Have we always been in war, and is it in our DNA, or is it something that came a little bit later down the road? So first up, we have a returning guest. You might remember him, Bill Franz, and he's got a particular perspective, hey Bill, of this evening's conversation. So he is a retired management specialist and engaged in various community initiatives. And congratulations, Bill, he's a published author. And his book called Mutti and Papa is a family history that traces the love story of his parents, who were Mennonite refugees fleeing war-torn Europe over the course of World War II. And it's available at the library, and you can even buy it. Look at that, you can put money down. That's exciting. So, hey, Bill, welcome.
Thank you, Matt.
We're going to kick off with you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why the story of Mutti and Papa kind of ties in and fits in with our theme tonight of Put Up Your Dukes?
Well, we're talking about war, and my parents, met in the aftermath of World War II. So it's something that I think a lot about. The book that I wrote, I might as well raise it here, is, it's called Mutti and Papa, a love story. So Mutti and Papa is mom and dad in German. So my dad served in the German army in the Second World War. He was 16, living in Russia when his father and uncles were taken away into forced labor, and he should have been as well, but he didn't happen to be at home at the time. So, it's a bit of a, it's quite the times that he lived through. But when the German army reached where he lived, he volunteered as an interpreter and served with the German army. And towards the end of the war, he was wounded and he was evacuated by train to Austria. And that's where he recovered from his war injuries and made his way to Germany, where he met my mom. And my mom's story is also very convoluted, but they grew up essentially, during and after World War II. And so it's something that I think a lot about. I often think about conflict. I mean, none of us likes conflict, but conflict is a reality. And it's an ongoing reality. So, I think about it a lot. I don't have a lot of answers, to solve the world's problems, but it is something I do think about a lot.
Right, good. Thanks for that introduction. We'll talk a little sort of more about how, obviously, because you've written this book, you have lots of kind of stories and a narrative and things that are in the background of the war. And so even though I know you're a boomer and a post-war baby, yeah, it still kind of lives in your world, because even though I'm also a boomer and born 12 years after the end of the war. I grew up very much in my youth in sort of a post-war Canada, and stories around it, conversations around it were ones that we kind of lived with. Our language, our use of, how we played with each other, all that kind of stuff. So there's that kind of connection there. And I had relatives, of course, who fought, uncles, and my father was in the Air Force and things like that. So thanks for that introduction, Bill. Let's go to Dax Williams. A lot of you may know him from a recent big flurry around the community. He continues to be a community-minded local entrepreneur and our local man about the town tonight. And he's also a martial artist. So Dax, I want to ask you in a sense about I know you're not taking martial arts to go and join an army and march off and kick people's heads off. I mean, I know that's not what you're doing, but what I guess drew you to this conversation, and why did you say yes, and how does that connect with you somehow?
I mean, I was raised by, not raised by, the primary influence of my life from a male role model perspective. My father was a World War II veteran, so I grew up, hearing a lot of the stories about it, but also seeing the after effects of it. So the situation itself, I've always found very, very compelling. Where personally, I've had quite a long relationship with dealing with conflict. Prior to doing what I'm doing now, I worked in a number of different security fields for quite some time, and I mean, war is almost a macro view on conflict in general, and I think that I just find the topic very, very interesting, and I think balancing it back and forth and talking about conflict in general is really healthy and a very positive move.
Nice, good. I mean, it's like, in a sense, as you're saying, is this the microcosm, the conflicts we have in our families, in our communities, and then that grows, and how does that kind of reflect this?
And that's the thing. I mean, violence is very much a method of communication between humans, and we see the culture in our history books. It's very, very much all over the place.
Yeah. Okay. So, first of all, I wanted to thank you all for joining us. And for this conversation, we're going to have a few ideas. I'll throw some ideas around and we'll have a bit of a conversation. And then we're going to play a game I like to call, and I quote. So what I'm going to do is then read some quotes, and each of us will, or each of you will have a little discussion, a bit of a response about that quote. And then we'll just sort of carry the conversation forward, if that's okay. So I think, first of all, we have to talk about what defines war and warfare. And people have always killed each other, but the idea and the key word around war is a collective, because murder is not war. We've been murdering people forever. We know we have a propensity for violence, but murder is not war because it doesn't have the collective involved. So I think we can agree that war is about a collective of people bumping up violently against another group of people in a collective.
Right.
So here's the first kind of quizzy questiony for you, gentlemen. I've been watching some British quiz shows, so I'm all quiz show tonight. Anyway, so here we go. So while we're here to talk, why don't we first of all talk about some reasons we can think of why people go to war. So just come out with some ideas. Why do you think some countries go to war?
I would say resources, probably the first one.
So economic gain.
Economic gain.
Yeah.
Even just like historically, again, just raw resource, right? And accessibility to it.
Yes, that's exactly right. Ding, ding, ding, ding, ding. Very good for you. And I was reading about this today, and one of the things that they said was, yes, it's about resources and taking the rocks from another place and taking them home. But there was another suggestion that the wars in the future, because of the climate crisis, could move towards wars about food and wars about water. I mean, those are still resources, and in a sense, they're economic gain. But that was quite chilling. When I read that little thing, I sort of thought, oh, yeah, like this path, right?
Totally.
Okay.
Yeah, it's something that I think about a lot, actually. When you introduced me, Matt, I'm actually a retired water management specialist. So I'm very much aware, like they say that, wars have mainly been fought over oil in the past few decades, but in the future, they'll be fought over water.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I had heard that and read that from a variety of sources. Okay, so we've got one. I have a list of 8.
I would say ideology.
Okay, now ideology, could that be like nationalism could be ideology?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nationalism is defined in this case as sort of one country says that we're sort of superior to you, and therefore we're taking our national identity. You know, if we look at Germany, for example, in World War II, they were saying, by the way, it's all about us, and off we go. Yeah, Bill, any thoughts on nationalism as a reason for war?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a very bad reason, but it's a very prevalent one. I think a lot about the First World War. I'm not a historian. I guess I am an amateur historian, but I think World War II was really round two, and World War I was round one, and World War I was very much a nationalistic war. Fighting for king and country. Fighting for the Kaiser.
Right.
God is on our side. I mean, all the slogans that get kind of whipped up in this nationalistic fervor. But when you're asking about your 8 reasons, how about a face that could launch 1,000 ships? If you have a face like Helen of Troy, for example. I mean, but I think essentially war is about taking something that is not yours, taking it by force.
Right. So, is there any other kind of thoughts that we have around some of, let's say, the identifiable reasons that we might go to war?
Well, I mean, you think of an offensive war or a defensive war. Obviously, if you're invaded by a foreign power, for example, when we weren't Canada yet, but the last war we had on our soil in 1812, when the Americans invaded, and they got kicked out by the British, essentially, with their indigenous partners, but. So it's kind of a question like who started it, right? Like when you look at the First World War, that war started because a nationalist wanted to start a war, and he did so by assassinating the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then because of all the alliances. And I think everybody was itching for a fight because they saw this as a chance to make some gains. We had World War I, so.
Well, you're hitting on kind of two of the reasons there. One is revenge. It's like someone pushed you in my sandbox, and I'm going to push you back, and I'm going to push you harder, right?
Oh, so for sure.
That's an example of a revenge war. And the others you were saying is a defensive war.
Yeah, I think a perceived slight.
Yes, a perceived slight.
Yeah, any sort of perceived slight can. I mean, if depending on tensions or anything to that effect. I mean, and again, when you look at conflict on that micro level, perceived slight, ideology, and resource are the 3 big ones that are going to cause people to kind of kick off, right?
Right. Yeah. Oh, our religion. Yes. So let's see. I'm going to read from the chat. This is very fantastic. She says, we have a comment that religion is, yes, and that was one of the reasons I was going to say. And in my reading today, which I was really surprised to find, was that more religious wars are caused from people from within the same faith and 2 different sects from that faith versus one religion versus another religion. So apparently a sort of intra-religious conflict is apparently quite prevalent, and it's not always about my religion versus your religion, but it's my sect versus your sect potentially.
Right.
Yeah, so we have religion and we got defensive war, so there are maybe a couple more, then we'll move on. So what about the idea of making your place bigger? So it's a fight for territory.
Oh, very much so. I mean, thinking about, Germany got a lot smaller you know, as a result of the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War, and you know, then Hitler wanted some of that back, you know,
Right.
so Lebensraum, you know, room to live essentially, and so that's one thing I talk about in my book, is just the borders keep moving back and forth because of war.
Sure. Yeah. So there's that fluid kind of territory. And then there's one very famous war that happened south of us. And that would be called what?
The American Civil War.
Yeah.
Civil
Yeah.
War, yeah.
Yeah. So that idea of one part of the population saying this doesn't work and pushing back and creating that civil war. Yeah. So those are the 8 kind of main reasons that often people go to war. Now, if we're looking, so if we'll just jump into one of the points I wanted to make, and then we'll get into some questions. There are kinds of 2 archaeological theories, and one is a theory put forward by the Hawks. And you know what Hawks are politically and around war. They're the ones that are more, say, aggressive and more warlike. So that was idea that we are born warlike, and we always had wars, and we always committed battles. And they start to look at some archaeological sites and see whose skulls have been crushed and how many people died violently, et cetera, et cetera. But there tends to be now a whole different, wait, I'm going to jump into my question, my first question about Hawks. Sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. I got too excited. So if we think that it's in our very DNA and we've always been warlike, and again, we go back to the definition of war as a collective effort, not individuals. So here's the question I'd have for you. And if they say that it's our natural instinct, do either of you or both of you, and let's go to each of you, think that it's kind of game over and there's no hope to stop it? And is our civilization really just kind of, you know, finger in the dike, pushing back against our natural propensity for war? So what thoughts do you have on that? Dax, let's start with you.
I think war in general is going to be something that's, I mean, there's so many extenuating circumstances that factor into, I mean, what pushes nations to war and cultures to war, civilizations, whatever. But I do think there is a certain amount of nature that, you know, there's conflict written into that code, and I don't think that there is a way, unless we come to an understanding thing where you'd have to agree and be able to supply,
Right,
that say that there is enough, and then on the other side of it, there would have to come to us, and there is no them. There's this collective we, and that's it, and that's all. But anything outside of that, I think that that conflict will just continue throughout, you know. Sorry, Whit.
No, you were kind of breaking up, freezing, and
I cut off.
Yeah, a little bit. So if I heard you correctly, I think you were saying that if we can get to a larger sense of who we are as a bigger collective, there's room for that aggression to deteriorate, I mean, to be diminished. And in fact, that one of the articles that I read today was talking about that very fact, that as we get to these larger, bigger blocks, then our smaller ideas become less important, and we're working in more collective, connected ways. Bill, were you going to say something on the idea of the Hawks? And
I don't
Absolutely, because I mean, at the core, there's only 2 types of violence.
Okay, I think you caught up with Dax now. I don't think it's game over, but I think there's a number of factors that, yeah, it could be game over just like that. You know, like, because our generation grew up, you know, living with the fact that, you know, the bomb was here, right? And you could lose your life, and the world could basically be blown up with all the nuclear weapons that are pointed at each other. But I don't think it's game over, because I think we have to keep trying. And I think as the world gets smaller, in the sense that communications are better, the big powers know that if we start a nuclear war, or if they start a nuclear war, nobody's going to win that. I think we're still going to see a lot of smaller powers use force to try and achieve their aims. The problem is, how do you prevent a small conflict, from getting bigger? And I think there's potential for really big conflict, say, between China and the United States, out in the Far East. There are people that know that part of the world have told me they're quite concerned, but I think we've got to keep trying. So it's a similar challenge, like climate change or the climate crisis or emergency. We could throw our hands up and say, well, game over, it doesn't matter what we do. Or we can say, well, let's keep trying, because we've got kids and grandkids, and it's our responsibility. We're in charge right now, so collectively, we need to try and do something about all these problems that we have.
Mm-hmm. Dax, were you going to jump in?
No, just what I was saying is that there's two types of conflict, really. There's asocial conflict. Asocial conflict is defined as conflict without outside of your own society, whatever you define that society is. Whether that's, and we see it in gender-based violence, we see that in race-based violence, religious and ideological violence. But beyond that, we also have social violence. So social violence is going to tend to be resource-based violence. So, again, going back to the whole idea of, once we determine that there is ample supply of resources and that there is no society outside of, the one that we all belong to, really, as a species, once you come to those conclusions and understand that, then there's really no need for the conflict, except for maybe a bit of a match of egos.
Well, one of the articles I read from The Guardian was saying that, I don't know that they were really arguing that we have a natural built-in propensity for war, but I think what they were saying was that, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, so they were saying that war in countries where we have lots of activities and lots of things to do. In other words, we're very fulfilled as human beings. We have social contacts, we have sports and physical things and all that kind of stuff, you have less violence and fewer war potentials. Where you've got countries though where there's greater poverty and greater lack of education, lack of opportunities to have an active, fulfilled life, then that this article was suggesting was a bit of a breeding ground, for war and for conflict, because you've got that, a much less sort of active, involved lifestyle. Oh, inter-conflict. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not sure I agree with that. In fact, I think I disagree with that.
I completely disagree with that.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I didn't write the article. I'm curious. I should look it up and read it.
The reason for that is that I have friends, or had friends, that were from the UK, and they said, it is a really violent society over there. You think about people going to the pub and pounding each other, or football, soccer games. The fans fighting in the stands and spilling out onto the field. I think any empire, for example, the British Empire or the American Empire or the Roman Empire, has certainly got a strong foundation based on violence. So those cultures, they have, I think, generally, a lot of opportunity compared to, say, countries that are not as wealthy. And so I'm not sure that seems like a sweeping generalization.
Well, isn't that good? And I'm glad you both pushed back. Dax, let's go to you. I'm so excited.
And again, I mean, just because a society is socially engaged, and just because there's a level of having resources, doesn't make them any less likely to be willing to partake in war. I mean, look at all the freedom that America goes to deliver across the world. I mean, let's be real. Yeah, you'll have resource-based wars in places where, like even what we talked about at the beginning of this, with climate change, what's the most realistic reason that anybody would partake in a, resource-based war? It would be because certain, in regards to supporting life and industry and all the resources required to keep those going. But yeah, I mean, I don't see how having the things makes us any less likely to be willing to partake in war and going to other places to just get more. I mean, look at the British Empire and North America, and look at the British Empire and everywhere, during the times of, colonization. I mean, Southeast Asia, North America, all the places, they had everything they needed, but they just wanted more.
Well, my understanding particularly with North America was that to feed the Industrial Revolution, they needed all of the physical goods from North America to actually feed their industry in the United Kingdom, because they had to get all the food and all the timber and all the beaver pelts and all that kind of stuff. In other words, go ahead.
When we look at need, food, water, shelter, clothing, and things of that ilk. I mean, there was no shelter materials that came from North America. There was no food that came from North America.
Well, not right away, but there was
eventually. But I mean, as shipping times, trimmed down and the likes. But realistically, I mean, nothing that was sustaining the British Empire at that point.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I read some other things, but we'll
it was very much the biggest trade that came from North America was, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying that the largest piece of trade that came from North America was textiles in the way of animal fur, right? So I mean, clothing. They were all clothed before they discovered the furs of North America, and they were just clothed more fancily afterwards.
Yeah, it was a big deal. Okay, let's move on to the position taken by the Doves, and we'll discuss that for a sec.
I like that last question because we got our dukes up.
I know. I was just thinking, holy smokes, I'm sweating. The Doves are the other camp of archaeologists studying this as well, and they point to the idea that warfare and the evidence of it came much, much later, and it became more evident in some of these archaeological sites and digs when the hunter-gatherer societies became more complex and there were larger populations of people gathered together in stable settings. And when we moved to an agrarian-based society, and then that's when they also began to discover things like fortifications around towns and villages and things, which they did not discover before when people were in smaller groups and more nomadic. So they were saying and suggesting this, the Dove group is suggesting that this began to develop in a sense as a cultural response to the complexity of the societies that were being built. So now we're not arguing, of course, that we've had wars for a long time, but I think the difference is the core question, and it's unsolved, and I'm not expecting us to solve it, of course, but what if war is more cultural and situational? Is there hope for a more peaceful future, for example, and how might we go about it? So in other words, if we say, well, based on the new research, we're finding that it's more of a, I'm not going to say modern thing, but deals with us more as a collective and a complex society, does that give us, let's say if we have that understanding and agree on that, does that give us a better toehold on it?
Well, I like that. I like that thought better than the thought that we're, condemned to endless war. I'm reading a book right now, The Writings of David Thompson. Obviously, one of the greatest map makers, that ever lived, and who explored the West where we live, and he writes about his impressions about the indigenous people. So, and there's quite a bit of displacement that happened. I think because of the fur trade, and the fact that if you could get iron, and if you could get firearms, and then if you can get horses, you'd have more ability to wage war on your neighbors. So I'm thinking of this one tribe, I guess we would call them the Mandans, on the Missouri River, just across the border, I guess, into the States. But how they were driven from where they were farming in the Red River Valley of Manitoba to poorer land on the Missouri River, and he was describing their what their homes looked like, so how they could defend them, basically. So I think I would agree with that premise, Matt, that when we shifted from a hunter-gatherer society, where most of our time as human beings was spent hunting and gathering food, to a more agrarian based, where we could have villages that we might need to defend from the neighbors, basically, I guess. Yeah, I think that as we realize that, yeah, we could blow ourselves up and that'd be the end. Well, maybe we shouldn't do that. I think, there are some hopeful things like cooperation in space, the International Space Station, that kind of thing. So I prefer to, maybe I'm a realist, but the glass is half full and it's half empty.
So Dax, if we're going to the idea that the dove, let's say the dove hypothesis is proven, do you think just even that potential understanding that this is something that came further down the line and is not coursing through our veins and in our DNA, do you think that changes how we could approach the cessation of war and the stopping of wars and conflicts?
Yes, hopefully. I mean, I mean, ideally, yes, I think it could. I mean, if we could lean towards something to that effect. But again, I mean, going back towards that idea of, oh, we didn't wage war before, before the agrarian revolution. Other things going on, and they were too busy. But it wasn't until we had things that we needed to defend, right? Which, I mean, the times of plenty came after the agrarian revolution, because I mean, when you're hunting, gathering, I mean, a number of cultures were less hunter-gatherer and more shepherd type cultures, right? Where they were herding people, and we see a lot of that in tribalism in Africa still, where you can't be fixed to a single location, right? And I mean, the agrarian revolution, refrigeration, all those things all factored into the ability, because once you have a stable food supply, you can then go and wage war. But where we are today, I don't see, there's always a need for new resources, and people are going to fight for those resources until they decide that, hey, it's probably better if we just agree to collectively use these resources. Like, look at, I mean, lithium. Who needed lithium to the extent that we need it now 10 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
And where does it come from? If they can't get along and agree to just collectively use resources and use what's there for the collective good.
Well, doesn't this actually, it's funny that you're not funny, but that you're saying that, because we just finished COP26, right? And you sort of say, wait a sec, how can we fly above this little planet that we are despoiling and raping and ruining and whatever the story is?
Yeah.
And come together and say, by the way, we should be sharing all of this stuff, and we should be taking care of each other. And maybe it's also an extension of this, the COVID thing, right? In an example of taking care of each other and leaving these smaller ideas, and I saying smaller ideas about I'm more important than you and more important than them, and I deserve more than you deserve, and all that stuff, right?
Well, I mean, realistically, the biggest push for conflict today, and I mean conflict behind resources, conflict behind territory, conflict behind this and that, get beyond this idea that a little piece of paper is worth X amount of dollars, you know, because it's not. A meal's a meal, a house is a house, right? Everybody needs these things, and they should be available to people. Nobody should have to suffer without. But as long as we adhere to this idea that money is the be all end all thing that we should be working for, you know, I mean, that fight is just work depending on your perspective.
Well, money, like everything we do, is a construct.
Right.
So in other words, we invented it, we made it up, and we, for whatever, maybe whatever organic reason at the beginning when things became complicated and we were living in cities with thousands of people and trading and trying to get along, right? So then of course it came up, but I think, I mean, I know this isn't the financial discussion, but as you're saying, money and stuff plays a lot into this around greed and around territory, around resources, right? That boils down to who's got stuff and who doesn't have stuff. Okay, so let's move on to around our, I quote, little portion of the game tonight. So I'm going to read a quote, and then we'll do like just a quick conversation about it and say, oh yeah, isn't that interesting? And you might have something to say about the quote or not, or you may just want to throw up. I don't know. We'll just read them. They're not crazy.
God, Matt.
Well, I hope not. Here's the first quote. Battle is the most magnificent competition in which a human being can indulge. And that was General George Patton. So here we go. Battle is the most magnificent competition in which a human being can indulge. And go.
Go, Bill.
Well, you know, I couldn't disagree more with General Patton, you know. Yeah, that kind of thinking to me, you know, and I just watched something that a friend of ours shared with us, and yeah, that kind of thinking can get you into a lot of trouble because yeah, you know, there's the heroism of war. I would say those days are long gone. And then there's the flip side is the just the devastation, which is actually mostly felt by civilians, you know, not by the combatants. This is not like the Reds and the Blues, you know, lining up against each other on the plains of Abraham, you know, to see who's gonna, you know, be the lords of masters of Canada. It's not like that. It's, yeah, I can't agree with Patton.
Dax?
I don't agree with Patton in principle. I mean, he was or one of, and I can understand where a person might kind of be bent on a bit of megalomania after experiencing the things that he experienced and being given the power that he was given. But also there's a certain rush in that conflict, right? And there's a certain rush in violence that when all things being the same, all things being equal, you know, you have, I mean, for the most part, two willing participants, it does something. There's a side to that would make a person think that way. And I mean, on that macro level, I mean, couldn't disagree more. But I can understand why he says what he says that way.
Well, you know, interestingly enough, because, and again, some of the reading I was doing to prepare for this conversation, a number of soldiers and modern day soldiers have spoken of not only the camaraderie, but the rush, as you say, that they got from going into battle, and that competing and the adrenaline, and for them, when they came back, they said, and I think this also happened after World War II, they were saying that the colors weren't as bright, everything felt flatter, everything felt not as heightened, which of course it wasn't as heightened. But that's this interesting other side effect, because you know that there's a number of soldiers who come back, and soldiers who aren't fighting really sometimes struggle because that reason that they're trained and that reason for being sort of isn't there. Okay, so I guess I won't bring out, I'm not going to do the other George Patton. Hey, oh, he's probably going to have to come back, I guess.
I got something else I could say about that. If
Yeah,
there's a
sure.
moment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So, I really wasn't good at organized sports, and I like being physically active. So I because of my eyesight, usually the last person chosen for a team. But it made me think of one of my brothers-in-law who played first string rugby for 35 years, for the Winnipeg Saracens. So, if you watch the rugby game, that's almost kind of like war, and when you could see that exaltation in the winners for sure. But the other point was that, I've done, a little bit of mountain climbing, and I'm going to say that when you're living life on the edge, when you realize that, I don't plan on falling off, but I could fall off and die. So I don't plan on getting killed. When I jump out of the trench, with my bayonet and run towards the opposing side. But I think perhaps in moments like that, you do feel most alive because, you are really focused on the moment.
Well, you're living in that, and then you're on the edge, as you say.
Yeah. And I understand too, coming back, if you were on the winning side, really, there'd be a lot of camaraderie. I think on the losing side as well, but I think there'd probably be a few more tears in their beers.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that probably, if you're engaged in battle, that's probably the most intense feeling you're going to feel in your life.
I would expect. I wouldn't be surprised at all. Okay, well, I guess we've lost Dax, but we'll see if he climbs back in. That'd be great. So here's another one. This is a quote from Voltaire. And he said, "It's forbidden to kill. Therefore, all murderers are punished unless they kill in large numbers and to the sound of trumpets." So that one is kind of self-explanatory in a sense, eh? But I like it because he's saying, as we were talking before, when the archaeologists are looking for, let's say, evidence as to when and if and how we became warlike, they were saying that, it's a collective effort. It's not me murdering you, because then that's not war, that's murder. Okay, here's one from Mehmet Murat İdlan, and he is a Turkish playwright. I stumbled upon him today. "Nations who are proud of their guns, tanks, and missiles, etc., are deprived of..." Oh, hey, Dax. I can't hear you.
There.
That's better.
My power at my house just kind of clicked on and off, so my internet went with it.
Oh, geez. Okay, so we've got another quote. You're just in time for another quote.
Perfect.
Aren't you lucky we're still there? Okay. "Nations who are proud of their guns, tanks, and missiles, etc., are deprived of humanity." And this was a man, Mehmet Murat İdlan, who's a Turkish playwright. So he said, "Nations who are proud of their guns and tanks and missiles are deprived of humanity."
I think when it comes to that, like, I would agree with that. I mean, being proud of guns and tanks and methods of war, I mean, it's like, it shows that you lack a certain something. It's like, lots of people that aren't, looking at it from a different perspective, lots of people who don't, or who choose to eat meat, don't necessarily love the prospect of killing something. right? Lots of people who choose to consume animals don't like thinking about the process. Where, you know, if a person is particularly proud of the weapons of war that their country has, I mean, you're kind of missing the point. Like, why do you have them, and what do you plan on doing with them? And if that's something you enjoy, you do lack a certain amount of humanity.
Bill?
You know, it's not something that we do here, but I can think of a couple of countries that do that kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, if you're going to parade your missiles through the street, you know, I think it's designed to wipe up, to kind of whip up nationalistic fervor. And I guess if you're, you know, if you're a winner, I mean, it kind of, yeah, but I don't know. I'm not big on that thing. Sorry, I'm mostly a pacifist, not completely, but mostly.
Well, that's going to lead to the next question for both of you after my next quote. So this is a quote from Albert Einstein. How vile and despicable war seems to me. I would rather be hacked to pieces than take part in such an abominable business. So here is my question for you. How far would you go, do you think, to avoid a war or to fight in one, or would you refuse? And what kind of war do you think, if any war, would be worth it for you? In other words, what excuse would be worth it for you to go to war? So let's just run those by both of you. And I'm not going to conscript you or anything, but
Yeah, I'll jump in. It's a really tough one for me because you know, I was raised Mennonite, and you know, we have a pacifist tradition. However, you know, for example, in World War II, I would say probably about half the Mennonite boys in Canada joined up, and the other half did alternate service as conscientious objectors. You know, when I think about to what my ancestors went through in Russia, you know, they were living in colonies, and they were pacifist. And you know, after the Russian Revolution and Civil War, so you've got the whites and the reds, you know, racing across the landscape on horseback. And you've also got, you know, the bandits. And because you're pacifist, you know, you are an easy target. So I know it was very controversial at the time, but the young men of the villages set up self-defense forces to protect themselves and their wives and children and the community. Very controversial because it went against their religious tenets. What would I do? I honestly don't know. You know, I you know, I realize if you're living in a country and you know you're a pacifist and your country is invaded and has to defend itself, or joins an effort overseas, you know, to, you know, because there's an unspeakable evil happening, for example. You know, I honestly don't know. I mean, there's lots of ways to, you know, to help the war effort without actually going to fight. You know, if a bad guy came in my front door right now, what would I do? You know, I'd probably try to defend myself and my family. So it gets really complicated. I don't think you really know until you're actually in that position.
right. Dax.
I agree. I think it's like a question like that. It's so broad. You know, would I could say that no, I would never go to war? Absolutely not. I would never say that. But at the same time, I can't say that I would never willingly participate in a conflict to cause devastation to others for that purpose. You know, for an ideology or something to that effect. But at the same time, I mean, I think there's smarter ways around it, but it depends on the situation, depends on what, I mean, like Bill said, depends on what comes to your front door, right? Things that need to be done need to be done. Did people need to go to like leave Canada during the Second World War to go fight in Africa and to go fight in Europe? Yeah, kind of a necessary situation at that point. But at the same time, you know, do I think that I'm like I would never, how do you put it? I don't think that I would remove myself from the possibility of doing it if I found it necessary.
So what do we think of, and we're just about time to wrap up. I was just going to say, what do we think of, and I will misquote him, I apologize, but there was a quote, and Bill, maybe you know this, of Mahatma Gandhi, and he said that when we're in the face of evil, we must say he had for him, there was no excuse to go to war. And he said, my understanding is that he said that obviously there are other ways to bring empires to their knees like they did in India, but he said that evil and tyrants will have their day, but they can't sustain themselves. And I think he was saying then that we just have to collectively find our way to move through that evil, not bow to it, because he didn't bow to it, but also not take up arms. So again, I think I misquoted him, but I think the intention of what he was saying was that if we look over the long arc of history, tyrants don't survive and their regimes don't live for very long or whatever.
Well, I like that very much. I don't know the quote, but I know of Gandhi, of course. It also makes me think of Nelson Mandela and I guess F.W. de Klerk that just passed away. You think of Nelson Mandela, I guess as a young man, you know, he was arrested for, I guess, being part of a violent organization. And you know, freedom fighters, essentially. You know, and then he spent, what, 28 years in prison, and then he was released by F.W. de Klerk, and, you know, who was prime minister because of the privileges that the whites had in South Africa. I don't know. I mean, that saying by Gandhi gives me hope, just like, you know what Nelson Mandela and de Klerk were able to achieve as well. I mean, that's hopeful, right?
Dax?
Sorry, I'm just trying to think of specifics of this quote, like what you said here.
Oh, the saying that so that evil can't sustain itself and will, in other words, burn out and move,
Okay, right.
You know, in a sense.
Right. And, you know, I would agree to that. But I mean, again, I think it takes collective resistance in one way or another, you know, in order to stop, you know, a tyrant from doing what they're doing. You do require collective resistance, not just one individual. And people, again, I think are oftentimes more inclined to conflict than they are to, you know, sit peacefully, than to not go to work, than to not support the machine, right?
Right.
So yeah, ideally you could get like-minded individuals that will sit down and say, like, it's not going to happen, and if you want to make it happen. And the other thing is, tyrants use violence. You know, people use violence to force people into subjugation. I mean, we've seen that throughout history. So at what point do you sit down and deal with it? And at what point do you stand up and deal with it?
Well, we've also got a fairly new example, not new, but the example of Martin Luther King as well in the United States.
Yeah.
You know, who died by violence, but who said we aren't a violent organization, as opposed to, you know, Malcolm X's approach and a different thing. But
right.
That'll take us down a big rabbit hole.
And in that whole situation, I mean, you know, you have Malcolm X who effectively got nothing done. Then you have Dr. King, who, you know, a lot of the progress that was made was due to him and his influence. So, I mean, there's no denying that, you know, sitting down and being peaceful and figuring out the actual issue, I would say is more beneficial, is going to provide you with more lasting power, because on the other side of it, if you just end up going toe to toe over an issue, then oftentimes all that proves is who was stronger on that day.
Right.
It doesn't give you something to build on.
Well, it makes me think too of the fact that a stone can be cut in half by a drop of water. As it keeps dropping, it eventually wears it away and works, right? So we've sort of meandered around and wandered here and there around this great playing field of put up your dukes. So I want to thank both of you, Dax and Bill, for joining us tonight and putting up with me and these rambling thoughts and quotes and conversations. I had a really terrific time. I hope you did.
I did. Thank you.
It was fun. Yeah. Thanks, Matt. And nice to meet you, Dax. Thank
you very much, Bill. It was good talking to you.
Yeah. So for all of you who are still there or are going to watch this, the recording of this, our next and very final Hear and Be Heard 10 Community Conversations takes place on the 21st of December. And we're going to talk about rites and rituals and traditions. And we hope to see you all there, and you'll get a whole gang of puppets hanging out again for our last Hear and Be Heard conversation. So on behalf of Red Deer Public Library and the Red Deer Puppetry Collective, and for Bill and to Dax, I thank you all and wish you all a very pleasant evening.